Hi, I'm San Francisco Chronicle arts and culture reporter Tony Bravo. Thank you so much to our subscribers for joining us here this evening. Without you, we could not do the work we do in the newsroom. At the beginning of June, I wrote a cover story for the Sunday Date Book talking about LGBTQ landmarks. Specifically, at the time, the Lyon-Martin House in Noe Valley, the home to longtime lesbian activists Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin, and the SF Eagle Leather Bar in Soma, both of which were granted San Francisco City landmark status. Also in the news at the time was Harvey Milk's Castro Camera Store, which is currently still being considered for national landmark status. This would be only the second nationally recognized LGBTQ site after New York City's Stonewall Inn. Also in the news this Pride Month, the GLBT Historical Society Museum's acquisition of the first ever rainbow flag by the Gilbert Baker Estate, and a pledge from Mayor Breed toward the museum's future. Tonight, we're going to talk about those landmarks and more, and what we stand to lose as the LGBT community continues to grapple with how best to preserve and present this history. Joining me tonight are four very esteemed panelists. I am joined by Terry Beswick, the Executive Director of the GLBT Historical Society Museum. Hi, Terry.
Hi, Tony.
Ardell Hefele Thomas, the Chair of the LGBT Studies Department at City College of San Francisco. Hi, Ardell. Juniper Yun, the Director of Cultural Affairs at the Transgender District. Hi, Juniper. And Mason Jay, a Bay Area historian and queer archivist. Hey, Mason.
Hi there, how's it going?
Thank you all so much for joining me. This feels like a great way to close out Pride Month and a great way of reminding people that LGBTQ history does not stop being important once July 1st hits. So first of all, I just want to open up by asking all of you the same question. What is it that we stand to lose as a community if LGBTQ artifacts, locations, objects are not preserved and or commemorated in some way? Terry, why don't I start with you?
Okay, sure. Wow, that's really a great question, and it's really why my organization exists. We're constantly exploring and driving into that question. And what really I just want to highlight is that we are such an amazing rainbow spectrum of a community. We're so incredibly diverse, beyond just the race and ethnicity, but also the gender and sexuality intersections. And as such, we have a lot of different stories, and we have a lot of different histories and cultures that we try to commemorate. And the thing is about us is that so often, we come into our own and find our identity in our chosen family, sometimes early in life, but often, in midlife or later life, even today. And as such, we get a sense of our heritage of the community through learning outside our family of origin, through our communities and our cultures, and so it's so important that that we keep those histories and we keep those stories of our inherited families, our chosen families, in a way that will speak to us, and often that's through places and through objects that you can touch, and stories that you can see and hear on video or audio or whatever it is. And often, fortunately, these days it's in documentaries and films and music that we get those kinds of stories. But often it's oral histories still. So we're kind of like tribes, we're tribes within the LGBTQ community, and we have such complexity, and it's really wonderful that we have historians and archivists that collect these things and organize them and translate them and interpret them in ways that will speak to young people and speak to people around the world.
Ardell, when I asked you this question a month ago, you said something to me at first that was along the lines of, what don't we stand to lose if these locations and these objects disappear? Can I just ask you to build on that sentiment a little?
Absolutely. I think there are a couple of things. Well, there are more than a couple, but first of all, I feel like our young LGBTQI2 plus people, what they have to lose is knowledge that we've had, that they're not the first, right? That you have ancestors there. Whether those ancestors are Lou Sullivan, gay trans man who did so much with the Janus Society in San Francisco and died from AIDS in the early 90s. Whether you have our just sadly recently late great Felicia Flame, who, was part of the Compton's cafeteria uprising, and has been such an important part of the city of San Francisco, every fabric of the city of San Francisco, not just the trans district, though certainly the trans district. And I think that time and again, it's so important for our queer and trans youth to know, you're not alone. Even if, the two people who I've just mentioned are no longer alive, their stories are here and their stories are with us and they'll help guide, right? And we have amazing film with both of those people that, I show my students all the time. So I think we have that, if we don't mark things and if we lose, don't keep things and don't mark them. I always tell my students, hold on to that flyer for whatever protest or whatever, beer bust, because that's actually going to be an archival piece later.
I feel like it's a great moment to go to Mason, who's been nodding their head a lot about saving flyers, about preserving artifacts. You and I have talked before, Mason, about things that we take for granted, like often being the building stones of archives, like flyers for Beer Bust.
Yeah, when you asked this question, I was like, what do we stand to lose? And I think there's so much, not only for the youth, but also the elders as well. I feel like that when these pieces of history are kind of either removed or not spoken about in the ways that the community knows about them to a wider audience, that there's an opportunity lost for courage and bravery in the community. There's an opportunity for vulnerability and freedom that we lose. The ability to just harness history and all of the magic and the power that our community has been able to share with the entire world, from something as simple as the Moog synthesizer made by a trans woman, Wendy Carlos, to anything. And I think we also lose the ability to see beyond what's going on today. When we have artifacts of the past and we're collecting artifacts to submit in the future, when we do submit our papers to places like the Historical Society or One or the Hormel Center, and it also destabilizes us a little bit in that we're no longer able to stand our ground as a community. So I think those are the biggest things we're at risk of losing when we don't make space for these things. I'm one of those people who keeps everything, and everyone thinks I'm a pack rat, and these things do now come in handy. You were talking about handbills. I have a handbill from one of the first shows Lady Gaga ever did in San Francisco at the Crib, which is a under 18 and over nightclub that I'll talk about a little bit later when Tony asks me about things. But yeah, those are the things we stand to lose. And those of us who are keeping those things are just kind of left with the charge to make sure that people continue to have interest in them, because they will have relevance either right now or 10 years down the road.
Ardell, I'm sorry, I think I interrupted you earlier.
Listen, somebody's got to interrupt the professor. Okay, we go on and on. But the other quick thing I wanted to say, and Mason, everything Mason said, yeah, absolutely. And really glad you brought up the elders. Absolutely, because if we lose this, it's also like their history's denigrated, right? It's like you didn't matter, and of course you did. But the other one is, I fear that if this goes away, we're actually doomed in some ways to repeat our struggles. Right? It's like there's certain wheels we don't need to reinvent. I hope, though one never knows, which administration is in office and what laws and everything are getting rolled back. And we have to remind people, look, this happened or that. But I think that's really important. It's also a reminder of our strength. There's always a reminder of our strength in these materials. When you see some of the very early stuff with the community in the 1980s, the early 80s, grappling with this disease they were calling GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency, to look at that and go, okay, where are we now? Where are we now with this? And we've come huge steps. We have PrEP. People are living, people are living, and people are living longer. But it's also very important to have that history there, because somebody, at least my students, are like, "Oh, I had no idea it was that bad." It's like, well, it's still a pandemic. We still don't have a cure or a vaccine, but it's like, oh, but it's better. Well, we still need to look at this stuff and this information. It's just so important. But I think for our strength, I mean, I was just re-looking at Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries pamphlet and reading, here we are in the 1970s, early 70s, what Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera wrote in there, and you could map it right to this minute. We need those words right now.
Juniper, I would love to hear from you about some of the work the Transgender District is doing towards preserving trans stories and also commemorating some of the locations in the district that are significant to that history.
Absolutely. So I wanted to kind of speak a bit about, again, what we stand to lose. I think there are kind of 3 different pathways that I see as an important thing to note regarding sort of the importance of history as it comes to us. History is not divorced from our present reality. It is directly connected to it, and it is the root of our future. I think that in particular, when it comes to LGBTQ liberation, if we are not going to recognize or preserve the history of our people, we are then not understanding our present reality. We are not looking towards a future that is realistic. Furthermore, I think that particularly when it comes to trans and gender nonconforming people, our histories have constantly been erased, redefined, destroyed and rebuilt, redefined by hegemonic systems that surround us. The Transgender District, founded by 3 Black trans women in 2017, was formed around the 1966 Compton cafeteria riots, which also has a tumultuous and still studied history of what actually happened that day in August. So we still, 55 years later, are really thinking about what is it that happened there and why that is important, because we know that that action has a direct response to our present reality. Without that action, the Transgender District wouldn't exist. The Transgender District recognizes that still to this day, if you're walking the streets of the TL in San Francisco, there is huge disenfranchisement of trans and gender nonconforming people, particularly Black and brown people who live in the streets and on the streets. But we boast the densest population of trans and gender nonconforming people in the United States. So these types of realities, when you try to not recognize them, you forget why these people are there and what systems aimed to even destroy them. The Trans District, within the last couple of years that we've been functioning, we're coming on our 5th year, have done several different placemaking campaigns, one of which included painting the trans flag on street poles in the actual streets of the Tenderloin, as well as hanging banners denoting place of where people are standing. I think that the third item that I want to say is that there are, assets to history that are kind of two-part. There are the tangible assets. The tangible assets are, places, things, and even people. The intangible assets of history exist in the psyche and the shared stories that we carry with us. So the Trans District is looking to reestablish those physical assets in our community to remind and to reignite the intangible assets that exist in the trans and gender nonconforming community, because we understand that there is, the fear and the reality that these things can disappear over time. Stories are like rare creatures that, if not preserved and helped, along their way, can die out within time. So the way that we do that is creating physical spaces, denoting physical landmarks and artwork that is, and businesses that are historic to the district. So with initiatives like the banners, with initiatives like our Know Our Place campaign, which is a public awareness campaign, we are asserting our place in society to then ensure that people understand our stories as important and necessary towards the liberation of all people.
Juniper, something you just said, not only about the importance of capturing stories, but the connection that our history has to our present, I think speaks to the work that all of us do, including the work of journalists. It's one of the things that's really exciting about my job is that I get to talk to people like the four of you about how we connect the past and the present to the way we are looking at events as they unfold, especially in marginalized communities, as all of you said in one form or another, where the history has been suppressed, the history has been covered over. And I think the work that all of you do requires a different type of digging at times, rather than being able to simply go to a repository where things have been kept for decades. Often these histories are a little bit more below the surface than they are in other communities. Terry, this feels like a great moment to talk to you about one recent discovery that is currently on display at the museum. That is the original Rainbow Pride flag by Gilbert Baker. I went to go see it in person a couple weeks ago, and knowing Gilbert's story, it was very moving to see it there in person. Can you talk about how it came to be in the museum's possession? Did the Smithsonian want it?
Yes, it was a long and complicated route from 1978 Civic Center Plaza at the gate, what they called the Gay Freedom Day parade, to the museum, and it traveled from San Francisco to New York to Texas, back to New York, and then I was able to go get it a couple of months ago in New York. But yes, it is to me, it's really moving and incredible just to actually wrap my brain around the idea that there was a first rainbow flag, that Gilbert and a group of people were trying to come up with a symbol, that represented the full diversity of the LGBTQ community, what they called then, of course, gay and lesbian community, bisexual, transgender, I think came along a little bit later as part of the acronym. But they were looking for something that represented the full rainbow of humanity that is queer, and prior to that, we had the pink triangle, which was of course used to identify homosexuals that were slated for concentration camps during the Holocaust. And that symbol was co-opted and transformed and made into something positive as a symbol of gay pride, but it really never completely caught on. There were a lot of other symbols that were used. And so, Gilbert had the concept of this rainbow flag. And so they made two large flags, and he had collaborators working with him on it as part of the Decorations Committee for Gay Freedom Day in 1978. They were 30 by 60 feet. One of them had stars on it, like an American. They call that the American rainbow flag, and Lynn Segerblom designed that one in particular with the stars. But there was a hand dyeing and stitching, and they were really enormous. And so when people arrived at Civic Center from the parade and saw these flags, I mean, when you listen to their oral histories, it was really an amazing spectacle to see in person. I wish I could have been there myself. But this particular flag is actually a fragment of that original one without the stars on it, because it was damaged. So from what we've been able to put together, it was damaged at the Gay Community Center that used to be on Grove Street. It's now gone. And Gilbert cut away 2/3 of it, but we still have, or he still had at the time, approximately 30 by 12 feet of the hoist. So you can see all 8 of the original stripes. And he packed it away. At some point, he moved to New York in 1994 to do the mile-long flag display around the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. And or 25th anniversary, excuse me. And he passed away a few years ago. We went to New York and got a lot of his artwork and costumes and flag work and brought it to our archives and with his papers. But some of his belongings were shipped to his sister in Texas. And when Charlie Beale, who was a friend of Gilbert's, was putting together a contingent for the 50th anniversary of Stonewall in New York, he reached out to Ardonna Gilbert's sister and asked for a large flag. And she said, well, we don't have a huge flag, but we have this one. And we sent it to him, and he was kind of disappointed it wasn't, a 30 by 60, but they carried it in the 50th anniversary of Stonewall anyway, not realizing that this was the original flag. Subsequent to that, a vexillologist who lives in Reno named Jim Farragon, who worked with Gilbert Baker at the Paramount Flag Company in the late 1970s, early 80s. He called Charlie and he asked him, well, whatever happened to the fragment of the original flag that Gilbert had in his apartment in the early 1990s? And this is when a light went off in Charlie's head and thought about this bin that he had in his closet, with this big flag fragment in it. And so that started a process, a couple of years ago. So it's taken a while for us to negotiate having it come to us, but there were a lot of folks who thought that it should go to the Smithsonian, and we had to make the case of bringing it and keeping it with Gilbert's collections in our archives, bringing it home to San Francisco where it was created. And so we were just delighted that the Gilbert Baker Foundation felt that was the right thing to do. And so, yeah, we have it on exhibit now. And it looks like we're going to actually keep it on exhibit through the rest of the year, along with the Gilbert Baker exhibit of his costumes and other artwork at the GLBT Historical Society Museum on 18th Street. And you can make a reservation to go visit it at glbthistory.org.
So this also feels like a great opportunity to ask about an announcement that Mayor Breed made at the lighting of the Pink Triangle earlier.
Yeah.
Terry, can you give us an idea about the future of the museum?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you. It's been a really eventful month for us, and really a great cause for celebration for Pride. We've been working on this for many years, actually, different iterations of a planning for a full-scale museum of LGBTQ history that can really represent our entire community in all its colorful diversity. And there is no full-scale museum of queer history anywhere in the United States, which is really amazing to stop and think about, given, the rich history that we have and so many stories to tell. There's the Schwulz Museum in Berlin, which is great, but Berlin's kind of a trek, so so much of the history originates, of course, in San Francisco. So anyway, we've been working with the mayor and the Board of Supervisors for several years And but she did surprise us that she had made a decision as part of her budget revision proposal for this fiscal year that starts tomorrow for $12 million for us to purchase a facility, a site to establish a full-scale museum in San Francisco. And so this is incredible news. It really it means that we're going to be able to make this a reality. We've done all the feasibility studies and we've tested the community support for it, and now we're going to just come around and really make it happen. So we have to pick a site and a building and really begin the planning to get it in there. And so I'm really excited about it. It's probably going to take us a couple of years to really open those doors wherever they may be. But it looks like the Board of Supervisors is going to approve the mayor's request. So yeah. And I feel like I've talked too much already, but I'm really excited about it, and I hope to have everyone else's participation in it as well. It's really going to be a community institution, and we always have been owned by the community, and we're trying to represent the whole community, and so we really need everyone's involvement in it.
I'm excited to continue reporting on the developments as the story unfolds. Ardell, this seems like a great opportunity to ask you a little bit about how landmarks, commemorated places, and also institutions like the GLBT Museum feature into your role as an educator. Are you able to use kind of living history, real places in the city as part of your lesson plans, as part of the overall philosophy for how this history is taught in the department?
Absolutely. I also work closely with Ruth Mahaney. Ruth Mahaney and I are both former members of the board of the GLBT Historical Society. There's something I forgot to mention, that I'm very familiar with the GLBT Historical Society. So in my courses, particularly in my intro to LGBT studies course, my final assignment is this last year's been a bit odd, okay? We've been on the internet, but pre-pandemic and hopefully soon as we move forward. My final project is I asked students I call it the selfie project. And if they're not comfortable taking a picture of themselves, they can have a little stuffy or something with them. But they have to go find 5 important places for LGBTQI2+ history, in the Bay Area. I actually open it beyond San Francisco. And they love the assignment. One of the main places they go to, that won't be surprising, is Harvey Milk's Camera Shop or Harvey Milk Plaza. And they say, well, I have no idea. I've come through this, Muni stop for ages, and I had no idea who Harvey Milk was until I went and did this. Because not only do they have to go take a picture of it, but they have to find out what it was, etc. So that one's very obvious. The ones I also think are really amazing, though, are, for instance, when I have students who wind up in the Valencia corridor, and they wind up at, what is the restaurant now? Is it Beretta? 23rd and Valencia. Used to be the Artemis Cafe, right? And it was like the Dyke Cafe, the Artemis Cafe and Old Wives' Tales, which was right there next to it. And such a great source for, so many queer and actually later out trans people of color in the community on the Valencia corridor. I have students go over to the Brava Theater and take photos, because that's where Queer Women of Color Media Arts Project has their free film festival with food free food every year. So it's fun to see them go out, right? And we have murals. There's some amazing murals that feature obviously trans women of color in the mission as well. So Compton's is another huge one I'm seeing more and more. You know, people go to take their photograph by the plaque and the spot where the Black Cat Cafe used to be. So it's what's nice about this is that the students then they get to choose. I don't say what neighborhood or where to go. You know, I often get folks in the East Bay doing the White Horse Bar and also where Mama Bear's bookshop used to be, which is right over on Telegraph. I'm in the East Bay. So anyway, but they get this real sense, even if the place is no longer there, it's like we were here and we're still here. And that parts of the city are so shaped by all of the different parts of the LGBTQI2+ community. So anyway, it's really, they have a lot of fun with it too. You know, it feels like a treasure hunt to them. The other thing that both Ruth Mahaney and I do is we work with the GLBT Historical Society and have students do an archival project. And in that case, they get to, again, pre-pandemic, I've certainly had Gerard Koskovich do several presentations for my students, and then students get to actually explore the archives. And one of the ways I love to teach the archives is I actually show Susan Stryker and Victor Silverman's Screaming Queens, the riot at Compton's, because it was in the archive where Susan runs into this kind of stray piece of information that she's looking for. She was actually looking for something else. She runs into this thing that mentions this transgender riot. And she's like, what? What is this? And she explains that in the film. And I really tell students, you know, you don't know what you're going to find. And that sometimes you think you're going to look for this one thing, and then it takes you down this path to something else. So I really try to utilize archival materials for that. Obviously our local ones, but also there are now the digital transgender archive, for instance, is just phenomenal. And it's like a global repository working on all sorts of stuff. But locally, I think it's so important to get students out of the classroom to the museum, but also, you know, through the streets of San Francisco and the Bay Area to find these places. And it's very interesting. Like, okay, you may be getting a pizza at Beretta, but hey, you know, 30 years ago, this was like a dyke cafe. That's kind of cool.
You see that through line, like you said, of how we continue to shape neighborhoods. It makes me think of the old slogan, out of the bars into the streets, out of the classrooms into the streets. Mason, I would love to hear some of the places that you've discovered that are perhaps a little bit more below the radar still, locations in the city that are associated with LGBTQ history. Also, I, in general, am just fascinated by how you get some of the stories out of people that I know you get out of people. Part of it is that you're a good listener, but it's not always easy to get people to talk about history that they were taught to suppress in many cases.
Yeah. When you asked me this question, I was like, oh, I don't want to reveal all the spots, but then I realized most of them are closed. So what am I revealing but history you can now go visit in person? Some of the places that immediately came to mind when I was thinking about history that often gets either under rug swept or not talked about much was, I think I'll just go chronologically. It was the first place that came to mind was a bar, and very similarly to what Ardell was saying about how you just kind of stumble on something and then you kind of follow a breadcrumb trail back to it, is a bar on 1600 Fillmore that was called The Big Glass. And it was open from 1949 to 1968. It wasn't open that entire time because it did actually get closed down for catering to queer folks. It wasn't exclusively a queer bar, but I think that's really interesting. That's a part of the history, the San Francisco history that's left out. often is that there was actually a vibrant LGBT community in the Fillmore. And it wasn't just predominantly Black. It was, you know, Jewish gay men, Irish gay men, Italian gay men, anyone under the sun, Asian gay men. And so I think that's one of the places that comes to mind. Similarly, in the area, this was more so in the late 80s, mid 90s, was the Rafiki House on Divisadero. I think the women who are doing that work there through the Black Coalition on AIDS rarely get their kudos. And that's something that I always think about, because even though my mom's not queer, she's just an ally, she was one of those women. So I think about the fact that I've never actually seen any history work done on them, and all the work, most of them were queer. My mom was the minority as a straight person. Where else? Cinnabar is actually a place that a lot of people don't know had an uprising very similar to Compton's a few years after Compton's in 1971. There was a lot of people would probably identify now. I don't like to assume their identities at the time. They identified as drag queens, but a lot of them did live in drag 24/7, so might have been trans women. They kind of fought back, not just once, but multiple times. And so the bar was raided a few times and then eventually had to shut down as a result of that. And then I think also the American Indian AIDS Institute doesn't get talked about a lot, is the work that they were doing in the 80s and the 90s. They were over there, I think, on Valencia Street. And the fact that the Bay Area actually had a ballroom scene in the 90s and the early aughts is overlooked. I wasn't a part of the scene then. I am now a part of the ballroom scene, but they used to have balls at, you know, the Women's Building and over in the East Bay. And kids used to vogue at Harvey Milk Plaza in the early 2000s when I was in high school. So I think places like that don't get talked about because we focus on these academic focused spaces or these very specific ways of acquiring information, which you kind of spoke to. Is I have very unconventional methods. They involve going to bathhouses, to bars, to any event that will host me. And I think that kind of self-reporting that you were talking about relies on, for me at least, in the work I do as more of a community archivist, I work both in the ivory tower and also in the gutter, is that I kind of have these three rules: that it has to be verifiable info, that it has to have a connection to something beyond the person just getting their name out there as someone who was the first to report something or someone who gave me the scoop, and that there's kind of got to be almost an innate talent to telling the story. So everyone has a great story to tell. Not everyone can tell it well. And I find that the people who are not necessarily sharing their story as often have more authentic stories because they are trusting me to kind of take this story, and they maybe never have told anyone or no one's asked them. That's often the way I get my stories, is I make conversation with people, which is something that as a San Franciscan, I've always done. Is I've been taught to walk and talk with people of all walks of life because you never know who they are. So yeah, I think that's it. Being everywhere is half the work, like you said, is going out and being seen and then known as a good listener and a contributor to social spaces. Also kind of a chameleon. And then for several years, which is something I'm trying to get away from now, I was kind of, I jokingly say the local town crier. I was, foretelling gentrification and talking about what used to be here very tragically. And I've really pivoted from that because it's making more sense for me at this point to share my queer gifts of gathering history and the 3 generations of queerness I have been blessed to be in a part of my chosen family. That sharing those gifts, regardless of how they are verifiable in an academic setting or how people judge the stories I'm getting, seems to be really generative and is only allowing me to do more verifiable work. So I think that's kind of the places that I want to talk about and the things that I'm doing. And then the last 2, before I let Juniper speak, will be Cell Space, which was a huge queer hub, I guess 3, Intersection for the Arts, and Grub Steak are 3 places that are often not talked about that were very influential, at least to myself and my generation of, later Gen X and early millennials.
Yeah, those are all relatively recent spaces too. Spaces I've certainly known. I think in the last decade, Cell Space closed. So the history really isn't that far away, I think is a great point to be made here. Juniper, you talked earlier about the trans flags that were painted on the poles. I think it was a year ago, 2 years ago, as part of some of the placemaking in the transgender district. I feel like that's the type of thing that we take for granted in other communities. Little Italy has Italian flags painted. The Castro has the rainbow flags. I've heard stories from trans people about what those flags mean to them, especially visitors to the district from outside of San Francisco. Have you had people reach out to the leadership at the transgender districts to talk about their experience seeing those markers, what it means to them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we were to talk about, you know, the optics of what that means, of like, you know, again, the physical asset that is seeing a place be, you know, accepting of your people. I think optically, the trans flags and the banners are so important to visitors, to people who live in the district, because it asserts to them that this space is theirs, has been theirs, and will be theirs moving into the future. I think that the inception of putting the flags up and doing the painting of the flags by Arya Saeed, my fearless leader at the district, was wonderful in 2019 when they first installed them. I think it will be a hallmark of the neighborhood and be a chance for folks to understand it as, you know, a unique space that is world renowned because it is the first in the world to be dedicated to the trans and gender nonconforming community. I will, however, speak that there is this interesting dichotomy when it comes to those who are from the neighborhood who talk about the triumph of seeing the trans flags up versus the reality that our district is, again, world renowned. We have folks that contact us all the time saying they really, really want to visit. They want to come and see the district. And the reality is that we are still living in an era where there has been generations of disenfranchisement for our people. When the district was founded in 2017, it was not just out of celebration of the 1966 Compton's cafeteria riots, but it was in the indignation of our people facing astronomical levels of marginalization. So when you go to the TL, when you go to the trans district, you see trans flags, but juxtaposed against it, you might also see high levels of houselessness, high levels of folks using drugs openly. And these types of things in general society do not read as necessarily like a tourist destination. So we are very careful in our language, in our communications with folks, that while we are here for the triumph and the celebration of transgender people, of gender nonconforming people, of intersex people, we are also here to uplift the existing population that is in our locale, so that there is going to be one day that they can, like, you know, live in a place that they are so proud of, that isn't just proud in its history, but proud in its present and its future. The dream of the district is that it will not just exist for 5 years, 10 years, but it will exist for centuries to come. I think that that type of existence is so important for trans people to know that there's a future for us. I want to speak on kind of what the others spoke about with historical artifacts and historical sites as, you know, these symbols of what our community represents. And the current, what was Compton's cafeteria is now owned by a private prison industrial complex. So the existing site is no longer within the community. It's never been in the community. Gene Compton was actually the one that would call the cops on the gender nonconforming people. So the reality of our district is that these sites that were, you know, the haunts of the district might not necessarily ever belonged to us, but it belonged to us in spirit. I think the word haunt is perfect, that the history of people, the etymology of the word haunt actually comes from the word home and a place where one frequents. And I think that trans people and gender nonconforming people in the district, as we come more and more into this space, we are kind of understanding the spirit of our predecessors, we are then also being resilient in the sense that we are demanding to take space and demanding that our history be recognized. So that kind of talk with visitors, with locals about the triumph of the banners, of the flags, should not be overshadowed by the fact that we are doing the work in the streets to empower transgender people, to ensure that they have, stable housing, they have access to like healthy groceries, very simple things that many people take for granted, that are, deeply rooted in the history and the preservation of our history, because today's people in the streets are the ones that are telling the stories for tomorrow. Just as Mason said, like there are storytellers in our community that are intangible historical assets that need to be preserved by meeting them where they're at and hearing their stories and writing them down.
Again, the connection, the idea that history is not a document that is dead or that does not pertain to the reality that we're living in now, are just so strong as we talk about these landmarks and as we talk about, reclaiming these spaces and reclaiming some of these objects. I actually wanted to jump ahead a little bit in the interest of time and look at some images of a few of the locations that we photographed for the story a couple weeks ago. If we could just get tech queued up a little bit to our slideshow. So the first image that I wanted us to look at is the Castro Theater. The Castro District certainly has a historical LGBTQ status. It's a neighborhood that has a long association with the community. Also, I think it's important to note the rainbow banners that we see here on the poles, like the trans flags painted onto the poles in the Tenderloin. This actually brings me to a question I wanted to ask everybody in the group. I feel like the example of the trans flag in the Tenderloin is a great signifier that lets people know that a space is safe. It especially lets a community know that often deals with issues just walking down the street safely, that an area might be more safe, acceptable for them to be who they are. I would love to hear from people if there are any examples of seeing queer symbols, whether they be flags or other types of symbols in their lives and their travels that suddenly let them know that they were in a space that was okay for their community. Like for me, the example that I always bring up is traveling to Ireland for my year abroad and wandering through a street and running into a very famous statue of Oscar Wilde and just thinking, great, a country where they venerate gay people. Like I'm gonna be okay the next month here. I'm curious if there's any examples of either landmarks or signifiers like that any of you have seen in your travels or even just wandered into in the Bay Area unexpectedly. Ardell, do you want to go? You're raising your hand.
I said this in the article, but I have a few. I think the most gut-wrenching, heart-stopping one was I competed in the gay games in 1998 in Amsterdam in powerlifting. And back to back, the same day, I went to visit the Homo Monument, which is huge pink granite triangle. And the three parts of it. One is underwater, one is on the surface of the water, and one is up above the water on the canal. And if memory serves, Amsterdam is the first place in the world that talked about what the pink triangle meant and apologized for what happened. And literally about a block away from the Homo Monument is the amazing and just take a box of Kleenex, Anne Frank's house in Amsterdam. And so it wasn't that I needed to feel safe there. I mean, it was Amsterdam in 1998. It was crawling queer and trans people, but because it was the gay games. But it was so important and moving to have that there. The other one for me, I mean, I have several, but the other one for me was also about Oscar Wilde, interestingly, and it's in a little back alley behind St. Martin in the Fields in London. And it's got the saying, you know, we're all of us in the gutter. Some of us are looking at the stars. But it had an official apology from England for what they did to him. And I thought that was incredibly moving. I mean, okay, great. You've apologized 100 years after, you know, you sent him down for hard labor at Reading Jail, and he died from that ultimately. But that acknowledgement, and I guess my theme for both of those is an acknowledgement of we really hurt and devastated your community or you personally. And there's making an amends. And to see that, I think that's really important. I think pride obviously is incredibly important. And, you know, I love seeing, you know, when I see a trans flag somewhere, the rainbow flag, for me, especially the trans flag, or the genderqueer flag, which, by the way, was created by one of my former students. But anyway, I think, though, that acknowledgement of that history, here's what's gone wrong, and we know it went wrong. So that's mine.
Does anyone else have an example before we look at some more landmarks? Yeah, Juniper?
I think, like, one thing, again, just to kind of reiterate, is that I think, you know, to be a little bit more frank, I think particularly for communities of color and for particularly trans femme people, we still live in a society that safety is not something that really truly exists for us. That, you know, while I might seem like I'm trans 9 to 5, I am trans day in, day out. I think when we go into the streets, it's not necessarily the landmarks again, but it is the history and the stories and the visibility of our people. I think the people of the community, when I see that they're out and about, as Ardell was saying in Amsterdam, like when you see people like you out and about and feeling like they can be in a space, that's where I feel I can be safe. I feel particularly it's like we keep each other safe and I keep my people safe. And when you have a physical landmark where people can gather, then that becomes kind of the symbol of it. So I think it first and foremost starts with the people being able to be in the space, and then the kind of attribution of a symbol upon it. Because while I do believe, like in the district, for example, we see trans banners, I don't feel that, you know, there is in this world a space that every trans person can walk down the street and feel safe. I mean, we are living in a world, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think that's a great point, that these landmarks mean nothing without the people in the communities that utilize them, that build them, and that know that they're there, know to commemorate them, know to stop and say, something happened here once, and it's my cultural ancestors that were a part of that moment. I'd love to get back to some of the images. Tech crew, I think we left off at Harvey Milk's camera store. Right, so this is the site of Castro Camera, which until last year, I believe, was occupied by the Human Rights Campaign. Can we go to the next slide? I think we have a close-up of, yeah, and there is a mural of Harvey that I think was added by the HRC during their residency there. It's still unbelievable to me that this would only be the second nationally recognized LGBTQ landmark. Can we see the next slide? So this to people watching at home might just seem like a house that might be renovated in Noe Valley sometime soon, but this is the Lyon-Martin House, the home of Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin, two incredibly important lesbian activists. Also, the first gay couple to get married in California, I think a couple times during all of our different legal stages of acceptance of marriage equality over the years. This was also recently granted city landmark status, like the Eagle. Can we see the next slide? Okay, so I would love for our panelists to chime in on this one. I feel like this is one we've all probably passed a few times. This is what I call the gay doll window on Castro and I think 19th. I've known this to be there at least since I was in high school. I'm probably about 20 years out of high school now. Does anyone know the origin story of the doll display? Okay, so I'm gonna need some of our local archivists that are in this group to do a little bit of digging for me. I've been fascinated by that very sort of community-generated grassroots display, shall we say. Can we see the next slide? Okay, now this is one that I think I touched on with all of our panelists at some point during our talks. This is the Rainbow Honor Walk, which is like the Hollywood Walk of Fame, or many other incarnations of this exist that commemorate different LGBTQ people that have connections either to the Bay Area or just the larger community. This is a very local and very meaningful one to us here at the Chronicle. This is Randy Schultz, who was a reporter at the Chronicle during the height of the AIDS epidemic. I think he famously wrote and the band played on. Can we see the next slide? Okay, so this is a vanished landmark. This is one that Mason and I were talking about when we spoke a few weeks ago. Formerly the site of the Esta Noche bar in the Mission. Mason, about how long was that bar a queer space? Do you recall? We thought maybe like 10 years.
Let me come off mute. I'm trying to think. Esta Noche, I know it was opened. Think about when it was opened. I'm trying to remember the exact year it was opened, actually. But it was there for a while. It closed in 2013. I think that was the first time it was threatened with closure. And I know it was at least there in 1997 because it was also the only Latin Don't standing bar during that era. I know that.
Terry, did you have info? I'm sorry, you raised your hand.
Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
Let me had to unmute. Yeah, Wikipedia says 1979.
Oh wow, so a longer history than I think either one of us realized at first.
Right. Yeah, and I'd really love to see it landmarked. Actually, I think that would be an important addition to our repertoire of landmark sites, along with Compton's, and so many others. But there are a lot of landmarks in San Francisco, actually recognized by the city. I forget the number, but it's a couple of hundred, I think, and only 6 or 7 are actually LGBTQ associated. So, I think we really gotta get organized, and and Juniper, I'd love to follow up with you on working on the Compton's landmarking.
Ardell, do you have something?
Yeah, so Esta Noche, 1979, I knew it had been here at least since the late 80s. So, but it was so critical. It was a thriving Latinx bar and huge hub in the community. They were also really pivotal in finally being able to get a queer and trans contingent in Carnival, because there had been struggles, and so anyway, I wanted to mention that, and they've not been closed that long, but I definitely think we need some sort of historic commemorative plaque and recognition for sure of Esta Noche and how much they gave to the community in the Mission.
I love that we're leaving this with action items. Like we're coming up with new things to landmark. Can we get back to the slides? The next slide actually shows another sadly departed venue in the Mission District. This is the former site
3464.
yeah, of the Lex, of the Club Lexington. There is actually a plaque here at this site. I'm not sure if it's an officially city recognized plaque or if it's something that was a little bit more grassroots. The Lex was the last lesbian bar in San Francisco, from what I understand. And it's been gone now about 6 years, I think. Do I have that right, panelists?
I think it has been about 5
Closed
or
in
6 years.
2015.
And there is actually a great exhibition up right now at the Haight Street Art Center that includes a lot of portraiture that was done in the bathroom there, which admittedly, not a regular haunt of mine, but one that I was familiar with. I know that that bathroom has a lot of iconography for the community that's maybe selfied back there in the day. Can we see the next slide? Okay, so this is the San Francisco Eagle, which was also recently given city landmark status. The Eagle, I believe, also just reopened this past weekend for Pride celebrations. You can see kind of a community-generated little temporary memorial there that says, "We miss you," during the period it was closed during the pandemic. Can we see the next slide? And this is part of the Eagle Leather Plaza, which is there in front of the Eagle. These are different plaques that have been added to the area. Interestingly, a range of different things being commemorated. Leather Strength is Pride from Eric Vincent, the San Francisco Bay Area Leather Alliance, Airbnb, a proud sponsor and neighbor of the Eagle Plaza. You know, room for everybody, I guess, in the process. Can we see the next slide? Okay, so this is one that I think has, that was hoped for by a lot of us here in the community. This is a mural that was done by an artist named Josh Katz, I believe, of the San Francisco, heavily San Francisco associated, San Francisco based singer, disco queen, one-time coquette, Sylvester. I know Mason and I also talked at one point about why wasn't there some kind of appropriate memorial or commemorated space for Sylvester. This was added, I believe, a month ago to the side of Oasis as a way of commemorating Sylvester's great cultural contributions to the gay community and to the city. Can we see the next slide? And here we are in the transgender district with an example of some of the painted poles we were talking about earlier. You can see sort of how much they proliferate the neighborhood. They're on, I think, every corner, every block. Do I have that right, Juniper?
Yep. So they are lined down each block in the district. And then what's exciting is that we're actually, so some of them actually, you know, because they're within eye line, are often face like constant like vandalism. So what we're doing is doing another series that are about 8 feet up to ensure that we also have ones that are left untarnished.
I am disappointed to hear that there's an issue with vandalism, but you know, leave it to the LGBTQ community to come up with an innovative way to try and thwart that. Can we see the next slide? Okay. I think we skipped our Compton's Cafeteria plaque. I wanted to end on Aunt Charlie's right across the street from the site of Compton's. I believe that that is Vicky Marlane, who is also commemorated at the corner across the street with her own street, Vicky Marlane, appropriately. I wanted to throw this up here because Aunt Charlie's is an example of a business that is still around. It means a lot to different members of the community. It is a place that you can go to and support in real time. not all of the landmarks that we're going to talk about, that we talked about, are places that no longer exist. Can we go back to our panelists? Great. I wanted to give a moment for any questions that the audience might have for either, for any of our panelists. Let me just scroll through. If we have any questions from the audience, this would be the time to ask them.
I don't have a question, but one of the things that might be nice to see moving forward that I didn't get a chance to mention was any recognition of Stanley Williams and Quentin Easter, who were the co-founders of the Lorraine Hansberry Theater. They were a long-term black gay male couple who founded that theater in '81. And I feel like there's never any recognition of that. And as we were talking about things that kind of get replaced by things, that their theater, which originally started around the same size as Harvey's Camera Store as a small storefront, then became a 300-person theater that they managed until it was taken over by the Academy of Art University. And they said, you know, how will we respond to that? We'll get a theater twice that size. And then they got like a 730 capacity theater. And I think their kind of struggle to adapt to a changing San Francisco and a diminishing Black gay community is never talked about. And I would love to see one or both of them honored in some way, or even just the existence of the Lorraine Hansberry Theater. You know, Lorraine wrote A Raisin in the Sun while in the Bay Area. I think even having a plaque for that would be cool.
I'd love to open up that question to the rest of the panel. Who are some of the other figures that we do not talk about as much as we talk about, let's say, Harvey or even Phyllis and Del? I think this is a great opportunity for the people watching our panel to get some names and maybe do a little bit of Googling, maybe even make an appointment at the archive at the Historical Society Museum.
Well, there's a few that come to my mind, and you know, one of our favorite collections in the Historical Society archives is the Jose Sarria papers, and we can't do this panel without mentioning him. It's like, I mean, he was the first person that we know of that ran for public office anywhere in the world in 1961. And that was running for supervisor in San Francisco. He did not win, but he did get, I believe it was like 10,000 something votes. And that really set a standard, and that there was a gay vote, you know, that could be courted by other politicians. And so, and of course, it wasn't until '77 that Harvey Milk was elected. But this early effort to run for office was huge. And of course, he was a drag performer and impresario at the Black Cat Cafe, which also should be landmarked in San Francisco, and really used that as a base for political organizing in the gay community at that time during the homophile movement in San Francisco. And he founded the Imperial Court, which and you know, there's a documentary that came out recently about Jose Sarria, which is amazing to watch, and I think you can stream that, and about his role with the Imperial Court, which has just been an incredible organization, raising a lot of money for AIDS and all kinds of gay LGBTQ causes. So Jose Sarria, we mentioned Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin, of course, you know, the founders of Daughters of Bilitis, and all their work for lesbian rights, in particular women's rights. Those, you know, and those, I think everyone on the panel knows those, and maybe many in the audience, but those are not household names, you know, outside San Francisco, and I think that they should be, and there's some incredible stories to be told there. Sylvester, we mentioned him. We have a lot of his memorabilia and costumes and collections in our archives also. And you know, I'd love to see a lot more research and storytelling about Sylvester as well. Finocchio's, some incredible performers there. But really,
Club in North Beach for those that don't know among our viewers.
Yeah, and we have the sign, which is great. You know, and I'm hoping our new museum is going to be large enough that we can actually put it on exhibit because it's really huge. But
got a big sign and a big part of a flag that you've got to make space for.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we had to bunch up the flag in order to really exhibit it in our small museum. But yeah, there's there's a lot, but I just want to like echo what Juniper was saying earlier. The history is important, but also the cultural preservation is important, and the living culture is important. The people, and for me, what always made me comfortable wasn't really so much a plaque or even a flag or anything, but it was, that same-sex couples were holding hands in the neighborhood. So, the gay neighborhoods are still important, and especially for young people. And, going back to the original question, I just want to also say, Tony, that, why it all matters, for LGBTQ people and especially young people now, we're still experiencing incredibly disproportionately high levels of societal ills. I guess you would say homelessness, depression, anxiety, suicide, alcoholism, drug addiction, and there's a reason for that. It's because of centuries of oppression and personal bullying that happened in the home and in the schools and in the workplace, when we were young and into adulthood, and discrimination. And so people have to cope and survive however they can. And I think history and that living culture that we're talking about preserving is the best antidote to all of that.
I wanted to ask our other two panelists, Ardell and Juniper, if there are any other figures that either of you wanted to mention whose stories we need to do some deeper investigation into here in the Bay Area.
Yeah, I can just speak to one that kind of came to the top of my head. Particularly, it's a little bit more in recent history, but we are the home of a late filmmaker, Christopher Lee, who documented a lot of what was called F to M at the time, like female to male pornographic images. They are a API trans man who unfortunately had passed away from suicide in the Aughties. Their work, they were working in San Francisco since the 60s on documenting trans masculine and trans individuals through pornography and things of that nature. And their work with their film, I believe it's Trappings of Transhood, and then Christopher's Chronicles, is very rich and diverse. I also want to state that they were actually the first, I believe they were the first Grand Marshal in SF to be a trans male identified Grand Marshal in SF for Pride. Yeah, I think they're a figure that could definitely be honored a lot more despite them having passed.
I'm asking not only for future commemoration and landmark consideration, but I need subject matter.
Actually,
I'm always looking for great figures like that to explore.
I'm sorry. Mason dropped in the chat. The juiciest thing is also, thank you so much, Mason. I'm a little bit rusty here. And actually, Mason was the one that introduced me to their work many, many moons ago. But his death led to the California Respect After Death Act. So it actually led to a legislative change.
Yeah, Chris was actually misgendered posthumously despite all of his legal documents being changed. And so it created a big hubbub about how he would be registered. And so his chosen family, a bunch of people, but most predominantly Willie Wilkinson, who is also someone who's not spoken about as much, and Chino Scott Chung were the folks who really kind of pushed to having his death certificate reflect the way he lived in life. And then two more I want to put in would be Jerome Kaja, Lynn Keller, and Blackberry. I didn't get to say those earlier, but I'll let Ardell finish us out. But I was like, those three people need to also be included in my list of folks who are not honored, and most of whom are still living.
Yeah, Jerome Kaja was just honored with a great show at Angle and Trimble at the Minnesota Street Project. There was a huge live event a week.
Lots of
about a
film
week
that
ago.
happened here. Chris Lee, Shine Louise Houston, Cheryl Denier. Lots of film history that gets kind of neglected.
And Ardell, do you want to close this out? Who are we not talking about that we need to be?
I think that some of the particularly going back to the mission, going back to the Valencia corridor, I think that some of the artists, many of whom are still living, like Esther Hernandez, who is an amazing Chicana lesbian artist and has done a lot of work, artwork in conjunction with the United Farm Workers Movement. In the 90s, she had these beautiful commemorative prints of that she did of Cesar Chavez, but she and she's recognized for a lot of her very political, radical, like possibly her most known icon is the take on the sun-made raisins that are the sun-mad raisins with the skeleton holding the grapes and talking about the truth of the herbicides, fungicides, and pesticides that are killing Black and brown people working in the fields. But it's interesting because she also did a gorgeous, overtly lesbian portrait called La Ofrenda, the offering. That's this beautiful tattoo. It's a portrait of a tattoo on this Butch, I read Butch Dyke's back, Chicana Dyke, and another hand offering with beautiful nail polish offering the flower to Our Lady of Guadalupe on the woman's back. And that actually was on the first edition of Carla Trujillo's anthology, Chicana Lesbians, The Girls Our Mothers Warned Us About. And I feel like, I mean, Esther is a huge part and still in the mission community. And I think still we have a problem of having difficulty really discussing and talking about those intersecting identities, right, within our community, and what a difference, you know, and how important that is. I mean, Shetty Moraga has written a lot about that for years now, since the early 80s. But I would love to see some, you know, I mean, Esther Hernandez gets accolades in so many places. Her work had been at the Mexican Museum. I mean, she's internationally known as an artist. But it's interesting that the focus doesn't also look at her being in the part of the LGBTQ plus community. And I would love to see that, because that Valencia corridor and the mission is so full of so many queer people of color, living and dead, who have created that neighborhood and have fought the gentrification that continues to happen in that neighborhood. That's what I would like to see.
I'm leaving this discussion so inspired about other stories that are out there that need to be told, about other landmarks that we can visit, about other parts of history that we get to continue illuminating in the work that we all do. I could not do what I do as a journalist without sources like all of you being willing to talk to me, being willing to share with me the fruits of your incredible efforts and labors towards gathering these materials and these stories. I would really like to thank all of my panelists for being here tonight. This is just such a great way to close out Pride Month. And I want to thank all of our subscribers for being a part of this evening also. Without you, we could not do the work that we do in the newsroom. We also have many ways that you can engage with us here at the Chronicle with all of our content, whether it's on social media, via podcast, via signing up for our newsletters, investigating our website, downloading our app. So go to sfchronicle.com to sign up, subscribe, download, do it all. For other events in the future, be sure to check out the membership page, sfchronicle.com/membership. Good night and happy Pride. And thank you again to my panelists. Happy Pride, everyone.